I worked like a slave for my parents, not because I was forced with chains, but because I was bound by love, duty, and silence. From a young age, I was told this was what good children do. Clean the house, cook the meals, sacrifice dreams, delay life. Family comes first, they said, and I believed them. Every day blurred into the next, and years passed while I gave everything I had. My energy, my youth, my future, without pay, without thanks, without rest. I watched others build careers, families, and independence while I stayed behind. Always needed, always responsible, always invisible. When I was tired, I was called ungrateful. When I asked for help, I was told I owed them everything. Slowly, I stopped asking. Slowly, I forgot who I was outside of service. I wasn't a son or daughter anymore. I was labor, free, replaceable, and expected to endure. The hardest part wasn't the work. It was the realization that my loyalty was being used against me. Love became a tool, guilt became a leash, and respect was something I was told to earn endlessly but never receive. 20 years went by like that. 20 years of silence, swallowed anger, and broken promises. I told myself this was normal. I told myself it would change. It didn't. Then one day something small happened. Something that shouldn't have mattered but did. I learned about a document, a piece of paper, a legal truth I had never been taught because knowledge changes power. That document didn't just explain my rights, it explained my worth. For the first time, I understood that sacrifice does not cancel justice, and family does not excuse exploitation. Signing that document wasn't revenge, it was clarity. It was the moment I chose myself without hating them. When they realized what I had done, they were shocked, not because of the law, but because they never believed I would stand up. They thought silence meant weakness. They were wrong. That one document changed everything, not just legally, but emotionally. I stood taller. I spoke clearer. I stopped apologizing for existing. I learned that love without respect is not love, it's control. And I learned that setting boundaries doesn't make you cruel, it makes you free. This isn't a story about destroying parents, it's a story about ending a cycle, about choosing dignity after decades of obedience, about understanding that you can honor where you come from without losing who you are. Sometimes all it takes to change your life isn't strength, or money, or even support. Sometimes it's one moment of courage, and one document that reminds you that you matter. I worked like a slave for my parents for years without ever calling it that, because admitting it would have meant admitting that love had conditions and loyalty had a price. It started quietly, almost innocently. Small responsibilities turned into full-time obligations. Helping became expected, and expected became demanded. I woke up every day knowing my time was not mine. My energy was already spent before the day began. And my dreams were something I would get back to later. Later never came. What came instead was exhaustion disguised as duty and silence mistaken for strength. I was told I was lucky to have a roof over my head, as if basic care erased the cost of my labor. I cooked, cleaned, managed responsibilities adults avoided, and solved problems that were never meant to be mine. There was no paycheck, no appreciation, and no end date. When I hesitated, I was reminded of sacrifices they made for me. When I questioned the fairness, I was accused of disrespect. Over time, guilt became the currency that paid for my obedience. I learned to measure my worth by how much I could endure without complaining. Years passed like this, blending together into a routine where my identity slowly disappeared. I wasn't asked what I wanted because my wants were inconvenient. I wasn't encouraged to grow because growth threatened the system that benefited from my stillness. Any step toward independence was met with emotional resistance. I was needed too much to be free. and too conditioned to realize that need was manufactured. The more I gave, the more was taken. The more I sacrificed, the more invisible I became. The most painful realization was not the workload, but the imbalance. Love flowed in one direction. Responsibility flowed in one direction. Respect never arrived. I watched opportunities pass by because I was told, now is not the time. I postponed my future for the sake of family harmony, believing that one day my loyalty would be recognized. Instead, it was normalized. My absence from my own life became so routine that no one noticed I was gone. What kept me trapped wasn't force, it was fear. Fear of being labeled ungrateful. Fear of being alone. Fear of breaking something that already felt broken but familiar. I told myself that endurance was a virtue, and that suffering quietly made me strong. In reality, it was making me smaller. I began to feel like my life was a service contract I never signed, one that renewed automatically every year without my consent. Then knowledge entered the picture, quietly and without drama. I learned about a document, a legal truth buried under years of manipulation and silence. It wasn't dramatic or emotional. It was factual, clear, unarguable. For the first time, I saw my situation not through guilt, but through reality. I saw years of unpaid labor, reliance, and benefit that had never been acknowledged. That document didn't give me anger. It gave me language. It gave me structure. It gave me a way to stand without shouting. Understanding my rights didn't instantly change my emotions, but it changed my posture. I stopped shrinking in conversations. I stopped explaining myself excessively. I stopped believing that obedience was the same as respect. That single document represented more than law. It represented self-recognition. It was proof that I had value beyond what I could provide for others. When I acted, the reaction was immediate. Shock, disbelief, accusations. Not because what I did was wrong, but because it disrupted a dynamic that depended on my silence. They never imagined I would protect myself. They mistook patience for permission and loyalty for weakness. The paper didn't turn me into a villain. It exposed a truth they were comfortable ignoring. What changed most wasn't their behavior, but mine. I no longer negotiated my dignity. I no longer begged for fairness. I understood that love does not require self-erasure, and family does not grant unlimited access to your life. I learned that standing up for yourself does not mean you hate the people who hurt you. It means you refuse to keep hurting yourself for their comfort. I didn't become cruel. I became clear. Clear about boundaries, clear about my worth, clear about the fact that sacrifice without choice is exploitation, no matter who benefits from it. That clarity was something no one could take from me, because it wasn't written only on paper. It was written into who I finally allowed myself to be. For a long time, I believed that love meant endurance and that loyalty meant silence. I gave my time, my strength, and my youth to my parents without question, because questioning felt like betrayal. What began as helping out slowly turned into a lifetime role I never agreed to play. Every day followed the same pattern: work that was expected, effort that was unnoticed, and sacrifice that was taken for granted. I told myself this was temporary, that one day things would balance out. But days turned into years, and the balance never came. I lived in a space where my needs were always secondary. My exhaustion was dismissed, my ambitions postponed, and my voice quietly trained to stay low. Whenever I tried to speak up, I was reminded of everything my parents had done for me, as if gratitude required the surrender of my entire future. I wasn't allowed to be tired, because someone else had suffered before me. I wasn't allowed to want more, because wanting more was labeled selfish. Over time, guilt became a constant companion, shaping my decisions before I even realized I had a choice. What hurt the most was how invisible my contribution became. The house ran smoothly because of me, yet my presence was barely acknowledged. If something went right, it was expected. If something went wrong, it was my responsibility. I learned to function on autopilot, suppressing frustration and convincing myself that this was what being a good child looked like. My identity slowly merged with my usefulness. I wasn't valued for who I was, only for what I could do. As the years passed, opportunities slipped away quietly. Education, independence, and personal growth were always delayed for family needs. I watched life move forward from the sidelines, telling myself that patience was noble. But patience without choice is not virtue. It's captivity dressed up as duty. I began to feel like my life belonged to everyone but me. And yet I carried the weight of keeping everything together. The more I gave, the more was expected, until there was nothing left that felt like my own. Fear kept me in place longer than obligation ever could. Fear of conflict, fear of being labeled ungrateful, fear that standing up for myself would make me the villain in a story where I had always played the role of the helper. I convinced myself that silence was safer than honesty, even as it slowly drained me. I thought enduring quietly made me strong, but in reality it was erasing me piece by piece. Everything began to shift when I gained understanding. Quiet, unemotional, undeniable understanding. I learned about my rights, about the difference between support and exploitation, about how systems of dependence are maintained through ignorance. It wasn't anger that woke me up, it was clarity. For the first time, I saw my situation without the filter of guilt. I saw years of unpaid labor, emotional pressure, and one-sided responsibility for what they were. The truth was uncomfortable, but it was also freeing. That knowledge changed how I carried myself. I stopped apologizing for existing outside of service. I stopped explaining my exhaustion as if it needed permission. I realized that love does not demand self-destruction, and family does not justify control. When I finally acted to protect myself, the reaction was immediate and intense. Shock turned into anger, and anger into accusations. Not because I was wrong, but because I had disrupted a balance that depended on my compliance. They had mistaken my silence for consent, and my patience for weakness. They never expected me to choose myself, because choosing myself meant the system no longer worked. What they saw as betrayal was simply me recognizing my worth. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't seek revenge. I stood on truth, and that was enough to change everything. The moment I claimed my rights, I reclaimed parts of myself I thought were gone forever. For most of my life, I believed that sacrifice was the price of belonging. I was taught, subtly and repeatedly, that my role in the family was to give without counting, to serve without expecting, and to endure without complaint. What started as simple help slowly became a permanent responsibility. I wasn't asked if I agreed, it was assumed. My days revolved around tasks that never ended, responsibilities that were never shared, and expectations that only grew heavier with time. I learned early that saying yes kept the peace, and saying no invited disappointment, anger, or guilt. As the years passed, my sense of self quietly eroded. I didn't notice it happening at first. It felt normal to put my needs last, to postpone my goals, to silence my frustrations. I told myself this was what loyalty looked like. I watched others my age move forward with their lives while I stayed in the same place. Always needed, always relied upon, always stuck. When I felt tired, I was reminded of what I owed. When I expressed doubt, I was told I was selfish. Slowly, my emotions became something I hid, even from myself. The imbalance became impossible to ignore, even though I tried. My work was as invisible because it was expected. My effort was unnoticed because it benefited everyone else. If things ran smoothly, that was normal. If something went wrong, it was my fault. Appreciation was replaced with entitlement, and love felt conditional on how useful I remained. I began to feel less like a family member and more like a resource, one that could be drained endlessly without acknowledgement or care. Fear played a powerful role in keeping me where I was. Fear of conflict, fear of rejection, fear of being labeled ungrateful. I had been conditioned to believe that asserting myself would destroy the family, that my silence was holding everything together. So I stayed quiet. I convinced myself that endurance was strength, that patience would eventually be rewarded. In reality, the longer I stayed silent, the more my silence was used against me. My compliance became proof that everything was fine. The turning point didn't come from anger or an argument, it came from understanding. I learned something I had never been encouraged to learn: the difference between sacrifice and exploitation, between obligation and choice. I came across information that reframed my entire life, not emotionally, but logically. For the first time, I saw my situation clearly, without guilt clouding the truth. I saw years of unpaid labor, emotional pressure, and dependence for what they were. That clarity was unsettling, but it was also empowering. Knowledge changed how I saw myself. I stopped viewing my exhaustion as weakness and began recognizing it as evidence. Evidence of years given without return. Evidence of boundaries never allowed to exist. I realized that love does not require self-error. Sure, and that respect cannot grow where control thrives. That understanding didn't make me cruel or bitter. It made me grounded. I no longer felt the need to justify my feelings or apologize for wanting fairness. When I finally acted, the response was immediate and intense. Shock came first, followed by disbelief, then anger. They couldn't understand how I had changed so suddenly, not realizing the change had been building quietly for years. What surprised them most was not what I did, but that I did anything at all. They had relied on my silence, trusted my fear, and mistaken my loyalty for permanence. Standing up for myself didn't feel powerful at first. It felt terrifying. But with every step, I felt pieces of myself returning: confidence, clarity, self-respect. I learned that boundaries don't destroy families. They reveal truths families may prefer to ignore. I didn't seek to punish anyone. I sought balance. I sought recognition of my humanity beyond my usefulness. Choosing myself didn't erase the past, but it changed the future. I stopped living as a shadow in my own life. I stopped measuring my worth by how much I could endure. I understood that justice doesn't always look loud or dramatic. Sometimes it looks like quiet resolve, informed choices, and the courage to say, "My life is mine too." For years, I believed that being a good child meant never keeping score. I was taught that sacrifice was love, and that questioning my role in the family was a sign of disrespect. What began as helping out slowly turned into a full-time responsibility that never came with appreciation or choice. Every day was shaped around what others needed from me, while my own needs were quietly pushed aside. I learned to move through life on autopilot, doing what was expected because resistance felt like betrayal. Time passed in a blur of routine and obligation. I worked constantly, not for recognition or reward, but to avoid conflict and guilt. Whenever I felt overwhelmed, I reminded myself that family came first. Yet family always seemed to mean everyone but me. My exhaustion was invisible, my effort assumed, and my presence only noticed when something went wrong. The more reliable I became, the more was placed on my shoulders. Responsibility didn't build respect, it built entitlement. What hurt the most was realizing how little space there was for me as a person. My dreams were treated like inconveniences, something to be postponed indefinitely. Any attempt to step back was met with emotional pressure, reminders of everything I supposedly owed. Gratitude was used as a leash, tightening every time I tried to breathe. Over time, I stopped asking for anything at all. I convinced myself that silence was maturity and endurance was strength. Living that way changes you. It shrinks your world. I watched opportunities pass by while telling myself there would be time later. I watched my confidence fade as my usefulness grew. I wasn't valued for who I was, only for what I could provide. Love felt conditional, measured by how much I was willing to give up. And still, I stayed, because fear is powerful when it's wrapped in duty. The shift didn't come from an argument or a dramatic moment. It came from understanding. I learned about my rights, about the difference between support and exploitation, about how easily silence can be mistaken for consent. That knowledge didn't make me angry. It made me aware. For the first time, I saw my life clearly, without guilt blurring the truth. I saw years of unpaid labor and emotional control for what they were, and I realized that none of it was normal. That awareness changed how I stood, how I spoke, how I saw myself. I stopped apologizing for being tired. I stopped explaining why I wanted fairness. I understood that love does not require self-erasure, and family does not justify control. When I finally took action to protect myself, the reaction was immediate. Shock, disbelief, and anger followed, not because I was wrong, but because I had disrupted a system that depended on my silence. They had mistaken patience for weakness and loyalty for permission. They never expected me to choose myself, because choosing myself meant the rules changed. I didn't raise my voice or seek revenge. I relied on truth and clarity. That was enough. Standing up for myself didn't destroy the family. It exposed realities no one wanted to face. And in that moment, I reclaimed something I had lost for years, the understanding that my life, my time, and my dignity were never meant to be unpaid sacrifices.